Chapter 1. Nobody could have known what lay dormant beneath the rock. Rain turned the stone of Site 4 slick and the dirt to a fine mud, while the stark floodlights installed in a generous circular perimeter around the derrick transformed the drenched basalt of planet M1819 into a crater of glistening black oil. Close to 24 drillers and engineers in hard hats and high-vis coveralls made themselves busy across the dig site, scrambling from one station to the next. Scott Blanton, the site's 56-year-old foreman, who was privately suffering from early onset gout, checked his watch. The project was over 2 weeks behind schedule. Each additional minute cost the Silver Valley Mining Company thousands of credits. The derrick rose to a grand height of 183 feet, a skeleton of steel whose distant crown block appeared to brush the stars. One star gleamed more than all the rest. The Desmodontae orbital station, tidally locked with the dark side of the planet. Always watching, always scrutinising. Blanton shivered in the frigid night air and returned his own gaze to the dig site. Damn satellite gave him the creeps. God, he wished his crew would hurry up so he could head back inside. The instant coffee in the canteen's pot might be lousy, but at least the facility had central heating. He spotted a young woman, no older than her early 20s, with long strands of blonde hair poking out from the sides of her hard hat, dash across the mud towards him with her shoulders hunched. Blanton winced as a fresh bolt of pain shot through his ankle. Hopefully the company could splurge on some bigger boots next quarter, and then composed himself, tugging authoritatively on his belt as his assistant approached. "How are we looking, Kelly?" he asked. "Engine, rotary drive and mud pumper all in the green," she replied, showing him the screen of her reinforced datapad. Raindrops pooled on the plastic and magnified the metrics. "Drawworks is good too. We don't have a full tank of drill fluid, but there's more than enough to make it through today." "So we're good to go?" "Looks that way, boss." Blanton clapped his hands together in triumph. Finally! He unclipped the walkie-talkie from his belt and squeezed the transmit button hard. "Everybody, listen up," he barked into the mic. "I want this baby purring in 2 minutes, you hear me? And don't forget your goggles and earmuffs. Y'all remember from Sat 2 how loud these girls can get." Blanton switched on the noise-cancelling feature on his padded ear protectors and watched Kelly do the same. The rat-a-tat of rain on his plastic yellow hard hat vanished. After 60 seconds, both the engine and the pump were chugging along idly. Additional lights sprung to life up the length of the rig. By the time Blanton's 2 minutes were up, every station listed on Kelly's datapad had reported a positive checkmark, and a great many of the engineers were staring through the dark rain at him from their posts, anxiously awaiting his word. "Metrics are all within acceptable parameters," Sunil said over comms. Blanton could see the man nodding to himself up in the control booth that overlooked the dig site. "All right, people," Blanton replied into the walkie-talkie. "Let her rip." The engines roared, the pumps whirred, the huge travelling block weighing thousands of pounds slowly descended through the centre of the derrick toward the glistening rock floor. The roller cone bit at the end of the drill spun like the rotating barrels of an old-timey Gatling gun. First the basalt beneath the rig's platform cracked as the drill made contact, then split, then ruptured completely, spraying dust and debris out in a vicious cloud of grey shrapnel. Blanton took an instinctive step backwards, though everybody on the company's payroll was either shielded by the derrick floor or well out of strike range, him especially. A second later, and the drill bit was gone, clearing a course path to one of the barren planet's myriad subterranean silver deposits. The rig chugged along healthily enough, as content as any other Blanton had overseen. A few of the more fresh-faced workers, those who joined since Site 3 wrapped up for the most part, clapped and cheered as he raised the walkie-talkie to his lips. "Good work, everyone." Blanton couldn't help smiling too. The mood was contagious. "Beers all round at the base tonight. Company dime. Took us a while, but we got there in the end, didn't we?" But already anyone with half a degree in geology could tell something was off. Though the drill was still spinning at a depth of almost 500 feet, its steady grumble had grown less like the bassy roll of thunder and more shrill, as if it were pushing against the disc of an axle grinder. Oscar, the other engineer tasked with monitoring the drill's readouts, opened the door of their elevated control booth and, squinting down through the rain, yelled in a faint Spanish accent, "She's meeting resistance, boss! Should we stop?" Blanton could barely hear him. Didn't need to, could make out the familiar groan of a strained rotary drive even over the rainstorm. But Mr. Novikov had been adamant. They broke ground today or heads would roll. Shutting down the whole rig to conduct yet another geological survey wasn't an option. "It's probably just a layer of quartzite," he shouted back, cupping his gloved hands around his mouth. "Drill's built for it. Up the RPM and push through." Oscar hesitated on the outdoor platform for a short moment, though not so short that Blanton didn't have time to think he might have a spot of insubordination on his hands, and then shot his foreman a thumbs up and returned to the dry sanctuary of his brightly lit booth. He and Sunil twiddled with whatever knobs and dials they needed to, and the rig's engine growled a little louder. That shrillness didn't go anywhere, but the drill bit didn't quit on them either. In Blanton's book, that was a win. Down into the depths of M1819 it dug. Blanton clenched his jaw and ground his teeth together as furiously as any tricone equipment he'd ever worked with. "Pressure's in the amber," Kelly shouted, not taking her eyes off her datapad. "It's still climbing, but slowly." "Just let me know if she hits the red." Blanton would have chewed his fingernails to the quick if it weren't for the grubby industrial gloves he was wearing, so he settled for biting down on his lip so hard his teeth drew blood. This was ridiculous. If he had to take the rig offline again, Mr. Novikov would have his head. His stomach cramped, dull pain spread across his belly like he'd been punched in the gut. Perhaps he should have laid off the coffee that morning. Hell, maybe he should have laid off the whole crew given how this dig was going. "Come on, you piece of crap," Blanton muttered under his breath, pretty confident Kelly couldn't hear him over the din. "Don't tell me those roller cones are blunt already. We tested you only last week, girl, so quit griping about a bit of hard rock and do your freaking job. Some of us have homes we'd like to get back to." She must have taken issue with something he said, because a moment later the drill bit became lodged with a sickening metallic crunch. The engine up top hissed and clanked as it spiralled into overdrive, and the hoist listed sharply to one side. Workers slipped and stumbled between their rain-swept stations in a mad panic as the derrick's girders buckled under the strain. "Red!" Kelly blurted out, a little too late. Her eyes were wide, verging on tearful, and even that single word almost choked her. After flapping her mouth wordlessly for half a second, she eventually managed to add, "Massive spike in pressure, sir. 6,000 psi and climbing." Scott Blanton stared in white-numb disbelief at a derrick readying to rapidly dismantle itself, then turned to the external gangway where he'd seen Oscar last. "Shut her!" He realised how futile shouting was and grabbed his walkie-talkie. "Hit the emergency override switch, you idiots! Shut her down!" No response from the imbeciles upstairs. He could see the pair of them panicking through its murky window of reinforced glass. He swore and thumbed the transmit button down again as he sprinted past Kelly towards the control booth. What was wrong with these people? "Do I have to do everything myself?" he screamed. "I told you to shut the—" The rig exploded. Blanton was thrown forwards and struck a column of basalt with his shoulder. The walkie-talkie clattered across the slick rock and dropped into a pitch-black crevice. Even with his ear protectors, all Blanton could hear for the first few seconds following the incident was a terrible ringing sound. His yellow hard hat had flown off somewhere, and when he raised his fingers to his throbbing forehead, they came back wet with blood. His stomach rolled again, this time with dizzy nausea, but he soon forgot how sick he felt when the ringing retreated and screaming took its place. The foreman watched in horror as his team staggered from the ruins of the rig like survivors of a bombing raid. Davis, the crew member responsible for the drawworks, was lying on the floor beside her terminal, not moving. Nevitt's legs were trapped, crushed probably, where the metal platform had given way. The mud tank had burst, and the pump was gushing out a geyser of brown chemicals. Somebody, Zebek if Blanton had to guess, was stumbling out of the gunk with their arms outstretched, presumably blinded. The engine, at least, had blown itself out. A thin plume of black smoke rose from the vent on its side. Blanton had a moment to think them lucky they'd been drilling for silver, not oil, that the compressed gases rapidly vacating the dig site hadn't ignited and roasted everyone alive. But the rig had one more surprise up her sleeve. Her derrick, already buckled from the strain to begin with, collapsed in on itself halfway up the tower. The peak tore loose and toppled. Its crown block crashed into the control booth, crumpling its roof and blowing its window outwards in a cloud of filthy glass. Blanton's semi-concussed stupor only broke when he spotted Oscar and Sunil emerge from underneath the desk inside, bloody and shell-shocked, but apparently not seriously injured. "Get down from there!" he screamed, his throat hoarse. He doubted his voice carried far through the relentless downpour. "Everybody, clear the site! Standard evacuation procedures!" Nobody was listening. That was okay. Blanton was no longer paying much attention to what he was saying either. From the borehole rose a trickle of fine white specks, none greater than a millimetre or two in size, twisting like dust motes as they climbed up through the latticed walkways towards the wreckage of the derrick tower. From where Blanton crouched they were fuzzy, indistinct, ethereal, but they glittered like diamonds when they crossed the beams of the floodlights. Everybody in the dig site who wasn't writhing about in agony stopped what they were doing and stared as the thin pillar reached a height of approximately 10 metres and began to spread out like a mushroom cloud hitting the edge of an atmosphere. Oscar and Sinnel clutched the railing as they descended the rickety staircase, their eyes glued to the specks as if mesmerised, while Scott Blanton rose unsteadily to his feet. It seemed strangely impolite to look away somehow. The cloud had grown to blanket the dig site like a stratus, and still the cracked fissure spewed fresh spores. Those closest to the rig were backing away, not quite in alarm, but getting there. Only Kelly, his assistant, felt compelled to approach. "What on earth is it?" Oscar asked, staggering to a stop beside Blanton. The man's chin was etched with bloody lacerations from the control booth's exploded window. "No goddamn clue," Blanton drawled. All thought of the disaster struck from his mind. "But it sure as hell ain't silver." "Whatever it is," Kelly replied in a faraway voice, "it's beautiful." She reached out to the dancing specks, her arm rising slowly and heavily from her side as if she were trapped in a trance. Her portly foreman snapped out of his own intoxicating reverie just in time to perform his duty as head of job safety. Not that the title was anything but a joke now. "Step back, Kelly," Blanton said. "I don't think touching that stuff's a good idea, do you?" Kelly paused with her fingertips inches from the closest specks, and turned her rain-soaked head towards Blanton wielding a sarcastic expression that said, "Get a grip, boss." It was a look, quite uncharacteristic of Kelly, that made Blanton want to hand the dumb rookie her pink slip on the spot. But then she suddenly doubled over and vomited all over her industrial boots. No warning, just a dense torrent of black tar. And when she raised her head again, no longer sardonic but confused and apologetic and scared, her wide eyes were tattooed red with burst blood vessels. Whatever in God's name those specks were, they made you sick. Really sick. That was enough for Blanton. He snatched the walkie-talkie from Oscar's belt clip without asking. "Quarantine protocol!" he barked into it. "Everybody back to the base, right now!" Blanton hitched up his trousers and sprinted for the closest door of the prefabricated two-storey facility in which the crew ate, slept, and whiled away the hours they were off duty. His ankles screamed bloody murder, worse even than the pair of flaccid paper bags he called his lungs. God almighty, why did a shit show like this have to happen to him? He could say goodbye to his career supervising dig sites. Heck, a role as the manager of a fast food joint would be out of his league after this. None of this was his fault though, was it? They'd run all the tests, sent dozens of samples up to the boffins up in the Desmodontae. The other 3 sites had been installed and automated without reporting a single major issue, and his boots lost their grip on the wet rock. Blanton crashed onto his knees and was lucky he could throw his hands forwards in time to keep from cracking his skull open against the black stone. Now it wasn't just his gout-inflamed ankles that hurt. Every inch of his body burned in delirious, excruciating agony. Even his teeth ached, and they were the one part of Blanton's body he went to great lengths to take care of. He felt as if his insides were turning to slush, while his bones tried to force their way out through his skin. Nobody came to help him up. He assumed this was because the rest of the crew were already safely inside the base. Blanton was the least athletic of the bunch by far, he couldn't deny that, but unfortunately this proved not to be the case. Though physically nearer the facility than he was, the rest of his crew were no closer to salvation. Some, including Oscar, continued to desperately drag themselves along the rock towards the building. They wouldn't make it. Others were curled up in the fetal position, or jerking up and down in the midst of seizures. Raising himself off the ground in the world's worst push-up, Blanton looked back over his shoulder at his assistant lying on the floor. Kelly's eyes were glassy, unresponsive to the raindrops hitting them, and her lower jaw was smothered in lumpy claret. He would have assumed she was dead, but one of her fingers kept twitching. He tried to get to his feet and couldn't, so with enormous effort he rolled onto his back and dragged himself into a sitting position against the sheer side of a nearby boulder instead. The exertion brought on a nasty coughing fit. His gloves looked like he dipped them in jars of blackberry jam after he was finished. Well, shit. This wasn't because he was out of shape. He was as infected by whatever those spores carried as Kelly, or anyone else in the crew for that matter. They'd probably doomed themselves the moment the drill bit struck hard rock, or whatever it was that had got in the damn thing's way. Metal groaned from the dig site as more of the derrick fell apart. At least nobody was screaming anymore. Nobody was making any kind of sound at all. Blanton watched the peculiar gossamer specks flitter and swirl as their cloud continued to disperse, then raised his head to the stars. It was getting hard to tell one from the other. He tried to wave the closest dots away from his mouth and nose with a weary hand, then gave up. There didn't seem much point in avoiding them anymore. "I know you're watching all of this, you rich prick," he grunted to the orbital station. He could taste iron climbing his throat, gargling his words. "Send a medevac team or something. We broke ground just like you demanded, so I swear to God if you don't send help." He slumped to one side as he lost consciousness, and 20 seconds later, the last fragment of what constituted Scott Blanton's essence ebbed from his body. From his left nostril drifted one Coruscant speck, then another. Gripped by the winds of the rainstorm buffeting the deserted dig site, the pair were swept away with the rest of the spores and assimilated into the planet's wider atmosphere. The Desmodontae observed. It did not reply. Chapter 2. There couldn't have been a worse time for Roger Hawthorn to be travelling. 68 years had passed since humanity was inducted into the galactic community, and his species still couldn't afford to build a faster-than-light skip drive worth a damn. Roger clenched his jaw and gripped the torn padding of his seat tightly as his economy-class transit shuttle carved a rattling path through subspace. He hated interstellar travel, never went off-world if he didn't have to. But with his boss's company the way it was, he wasn't exactly faced with much choice. Not that his fellow passengers looked even half as nervous as he felt. He guessed they were used to the journey, had survived enough voyages to and from the relay station to know that superluminal accidents were exceptionally rare. Roger was sharing the cramped, stuffy cabin with 4 others, a gruff, grey-bearded man in his 60s who Roger suspected was ex-UEC military, a middle-aged woman in a sharp suit and bright red buzzcut, likely a corporate professional like himself, and a mother and daughter, sitting bunched together and enjoying a video playing on an archaic datapad. The mother was in her mid-30s, approximately Roger's age, and he would have pegged the daughter as 6. There were also 2 pilots in the sealed compartment up front. Luggage was stacked up and strapped down. Everyone was wearing coats. Roger had tried reading a novel to while away the time, a classic James Patterson thriller he'd started a few nights ago, but the shuttle's endless shaking made him feel sick. Nor could he concentrate on any of the words, even when he switched to the legal papers he was due to review. A few albums had done the trick instead, but now he was out of music, and the 2.5 milligrams of diazepam he took before the flight was wearing off, and no amount of checking his watch seemed to move the digits any faster. "First time skipping subspace?" asked the gruff ex-soldier sitting opposite him. It was the first thing Roger had heard the old man say all trip. "Third, and it gets worse every journey," Roger replied, steadying his voice so as not to sound too much like a feeble pencil pusher. "Shouldn't we have arrived by now?" "They're behind schedule," the man stated matter-of-factly. He didn't break eye contact. "Happens sometimes. Shouldn't be long now." As if listening into their conversation, the intercom speaker embedded in the front of the cabin chose that moment to crackle and whine. The waxy fluorescent light strips flickered slightly as one of the pilots addressed the passengers.
"Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We should be dropping out of subspace in the next 5 minutes and then making our approach towards the Polidori Galatz relay station shortly after that. Please have your papers ready for inspection before we arrive."
The speaker spluttered off. The lights grew slightly brighter. "See?" The veteran raised a single eyebrow. "Told you." "Decent enough spot, is it? The relay station, I mean." The grey-bearded man barked out a solitary laugh, tightened the lapels of his thick coat over his chest, and went back to staring dead ahead. "It's airtight, I'll give it that." Roger smiled politely and resumed tapping the greasy floor with his foot. One of the screws beneath his seat was unravelling itself from its panel. He swiveled his shoe to trap it and keep the shuttle from disintegrating. 10 more minutes and he was off this death trap for good. It took 12 minutes for them to land, actually, and a further 7 spent sitting apprehensively while the pilot shut down the shuttle's primary systems one by one, but Roger Hawthorn was finally free. He hurriedly descended the tread-plated metal steps outside with his travel suitcase dangling from one hand, and took a greedy gulp of fresh air. He coughed. It tasted of hot rubber and engine oil. "Wouldn't breathe too deep if I were you," grunted the older man, shaking his head as he marched past. "Somnium fumes ain't great for your lungs." "Wonderful." Roger mumbled to himself. I can tell I'm going to love this place. He followed the veteran across the hangar towards the security checkpoint on the far side. The man was sprightly for his age, easily outpacing Roger, and they both overtook the mother and daughter. The latter was easily distracted by the assortment of ships docked in the hangar's various bays, and Roger hardly blamed her. Some of them were staggeringly large. Nobody was as quick as the red-headed corpo woman, however. She'd been first off the shuttle and was already speaking to the guards stationed inside the checkpoint's booth. Roger joined the queue and, resting his suitcase by his feet, took a chance to properly soak in the hangar. It was noisy, unevenly lit, and, as Roger had already discovered to his great misfortune, smelled like a junkyard on a hot summer's day, despite the hall's cool ambient temperature. Most of the vehicles parked within its towering concrete walls were commercial in nature, tankers and delivery shuttles. Mechanics and engineers in stained green overalls hauled fuel lines across sparse floors stencilled with yellow paint, while cargo handlers drove forklift trucks loaded with supply crates to warehouses elsewhere on the station. The older man's time at the booth was short. Suddenly it was Roger's turn. He stepped forward and slid his identification through the gap in the counter below the bulletproof window. "Reason for your visit?" the guard asked, running Roger's card under a scanner. The man looked tired, his uniform as wrinkled as the bags under his eyes. "Just passing through." "Yeah?" The security guard smirked bitterly. "That's what I said 4 years ago. What's your final destination?" "The Desmodontae orbital station, over in the M18 system." The guard glanced up from his screen, scoffed like he was privy to some strange private joke, and went back to checking the files in his database. Then he handed Roger his ID back and waved him through the gate. "Have a pleasant stay. Next." The Polidori Galatz relay station was a glorified rest stop, a motorway service station for the interstellar age. Named after its system's twin stars, the relay station offered weary travellers a place to stop, refuel, grab a bite to eat, and even sleep. Few human ships had space for bedding. It housed 1,200 full-time residents. Roger Hawthorn had spent his trip from New Terra expecting the worst, but while it was no Ritz-Carlton, the station wasn't anywhere near as awful as he feared. Cuboid storefronts had been built into cracked concrete walls, now littered with flickering neon advertisements and signs forged from salvaged scrap metal. The unit closest to him was unoccupied, save for a pair of touchscreen information kiosks for new arrivals. Further on, Roger spotted a general store and an electronics repair shop. He counted half a dozen pedestrians milling about, most of them in work uniforms. Large circular heat lamps hung suspended from the exposed pipework in the ceiling, simultaneously bathing the path in a sickly yellow light and preventing the station from plummeting to an icy sub-zero temperature. Even so, Roger was grateful for his coat. The place was clean enough. An automated robot with brushes whirring under its chassis was presently sweeping up discarded plastic wrappers from around the steel girders outside each store. The air wafting out from overhead vents with wavy black strips attached to their grates was stale and recycled, but that was to be expected anywhere off-world, and even the strong odour of kebab meat wafting from further up the street wasn't totally unwelcome. Of course, first impressions weren't everything. This strip was tantamount to the station's front door. God knows how rough the lower levels looked. "It's just the one night," he muttered under his breath as he strolled off in search of his hotel. Roger wasn't pretentious. A little old-fashioned, maybe. He liked the tactile feel of a 21st century suitcase, even though Erin kept telling him to upgrade to one of those self-guiding luggage drones. But certainly not pretentious. He didn't need fancy gizmos and expensive suits. He didn't judge those who lived in the poorer districts of Holly Hill, had grown up living on the outskirts himself. Roger liked to keep things simple, that's all. And to Roger, simple meant living on solid, grassy ground where anything you wanted was a short walk away, and a stray meteor fragment didn't lead to catastrophic depressurization. Was that really too much to ask? The stores didn't actually have fronts, not unless you counted the corrugated shutters that either rolled up into the ceiling or folded in on themselves to one side. Roger glanced into the general store and saw display stands stacked with imported essentials, snacks and beers that no doubt cost twice as much as they would back home on New Terra. He wouldn't buy anything, not even using the company account, but it might be worth visiting in case they had anything foreign in stock. Erin would get a kick out of any pictures he sent back. The electronics outlet was definitely more tinkering workstation than shop, with one long counter covered in half-finished projects, and tools and spare parts hanging from the ceiling. Roger guessed repairing what you already had was far more economical on a remote space station than purchasing something new. Some of the units had their shutters down, but he also passed an entertainment kiosk selling digital books, holo movies and sim cartridges, plus a range of cyberdecks, and further on a small pharmacy staffed by a tattooed Asian man in a traditional white coat. The shelves lining its walls were brimming with med boxes and hypo needles. Industrial metal music blasted from the stockroom in the back. Built into a corner at the far end of the strip was a drinking hole fashioned to resemble either an Old English pub or an American speakeasy. It was hard to tell. It was multiple units in size and windows were built into the concrete. Maisie's, said the sign above its door. The room inside looked dim and cosy, all weathered woods and tarnished bronze trims and faded red cushions. Outside its door, metal but painted to look like dark wood, stood a blue holographic man dressed like a particularly dapper member of a barbershop quartet. "Looks like there's a new face in town," the virtual program said to Roger as he approached. "Looking to wet your whistle? We've got beers, we've got wine. Maisie has everything that's fine." "No, thank you." "You're lost, sir." The hologram tipped his skimmer hat in farewell. "You won't find anywhere nicer on the PG station than Maisie's, baby." Roger chuckled to himself and shook his head. It was kind of endearing in a tacky sort of way. Maybe he ought to swing by Maisie's after he got settled in. After such a long and hellish flight, he deserved a stiff drink, didn't he? That was presuming he could find where he was staying the night. Standing at the crossroads outside the bar, he was beginning to suspect he should have stopped by those information booths directly past the security checkpoint. If there were signs for his hotel nestled amongst the layers of crudely hammered sheet metal, he couldn't see them. "Excuse me," Roger said, flagging down a woman walking along the path perpendicular to his own. She wore faded denim dungarees. "You don't happen to know where I can find Starlight Slumber, do you?" The stranger smiled and pointed to the ramp behind them. "Head up there, stop at the next floor, and follow the walkway to the left," she said. "There's a big sign out front. You can't miss it." "Oh, don't underestimate me," Roger replied, giving her a grateful wink. "Thank you." "No sweat," she said, continuing on her way towards a door leading to the maintenance levels. He dragged his suitcase up the ramp and decided Erin was right. Luggage drones were a lot less work. Roger was so lost in thought, partly about Erin, mostly about how a backpack could have saved him a lot of arm ache, he very nearly didn't realise he was walking past one of the space station's exterior windows. Struck by the vista, he stopped short, the extended handle slipping from his fingers. The twin stars of the Polidori Galatz system glared back at him from the infinite darkness like a pair of fiery, incandescent eyes. Galatz was smaller and a yellowy white colour, whereas Polidori was a furious red and occupied almost a quarter of the window. The disparity in size and distance gave Roger the impression that the galaxy itself was turning its face from the station. If he tried, he could trace a mouth and nose from the neighbouring constellations. It might have been funny had the image not made him feel so terribly, unexplainably alone. Roger must have stood gawping for a good 60 seconds or more, proving himself a proper tourist, that's for certain, before he blinked his head clear. The view was almost worth the shuttle ride out there. Almost. It was a shame about the crust of space gunk building up around the edge of the window, though. He gave the glass a hesitant knock with his knuckles. Somebody needed to get out there and give it a proper scrub. He grabbed his suitcase before it could roll down, hauled it up the rest of the ramp, and discovered 2 workmen in dusty coveralls blocking the top. One was standing at the summit of a long ladder, screwing the panel of a ventilation shaft back in. The other was older, and had his hands cupped around his mouth. He didn't look best pleased. "Hey Andy, you fixed the refractors yet?" "Nah, boss," the man at the top of the ladder replied. "Alex said this duct was making a hell of a racket, and—" "I don't care what Alexandra says," the supervisor yelled. "Prioritise the lenses. Do you know what happens when sunlight doesn't reach the lower levels, Andy? People get depressed. I don't want to be the one who has to explain to the clean-up crew why there's another mess in the airlock." Roger exhaled sharply through his nose as he squeezed past the ladder. Just as he predicted, the Polidori Galatz relay station was falling apart. Then again, what wasn't these days? Even Roger's apartment had a leaky shower faucet that refused to be fixed. Ahead of him lay more outlets, most busier than the ones below, including what looked like a promising Chinese restaurant. Something to consider. The shuttle hadn't come with an in-flight meal, and he was damn near starving. But before turning down the hall to his left as instructed, Roger glanced casually to the right, and what he saw slithering there made the view of the twin stars seem utterly pedestrian in comparison. He'd seen pictures of tubers on the extranet, of course, along with dozens of other strange species, but it was still shocking to witness one in the flesh. Its short, squat body was like a giant jungle flower, with thick petals that curled outward to the floor. It moved using a collection of nubs and tendrils on its underside. Roger assumed that was also where its mouth and anus were, but he wasn't sure. From the centre of its mass extended a pair of starmen, technically tentacles, that acted as both eyes and hands. It wore no clothes, but fastened to its petal-like folds were 2 leather satchels in which it was presently stashing the fruit it had just purchased. Roger didn't know if the creature could see him staring, what with having no discernible facial features and all, but he didn't want to be rude. Nobody else seemed surprised by the alien's presence. He bowed his head and forced himself to march down the hall to his lodgings. Starlight Slumber was easy to identify. Its name was plastered across a screen above its entrance in big, bold capital letters that periodically scrolled aside to make room for "Rooms Available." A man was leaning against the wall outside, smoking a foul-smelling vape. Roger gave the tuber down the corridor another incredulous glance and then hurried through the hotel's translucent automatic doors. A small room of clean concrete walls, painted a light blue colour. Not too shabby. A young woman, possibly still a teenager, reclined in a chair behind the sole desk to the rear. The room's only other furniture was an iron bench lining the right-hand wall. The girl was wearing a bright blue gilet. Her dark purple hair was undercut, and she had a skull port for SIM cartridges installed over her left temple. "Excuse me," Roger said as he approached the desk, still shooting disbelieving looks over his shoulder. "I should have a room booked for me under the name of—" "You've got a room number and access code, don't you?" the girl replied, not looking up at him from her fingernails. "Yes, I think so. There was a confirmation email somewhere." "Head on through." She waved lazily at the door to Roger's right. "Bunks are on your left through the door and rooms are near the back. Let me know if you have any trouble." Roger left through the other door without saying thank you. The girl was probably somebody's niece getting paid pennies per hour. Starlight Slumber, a chain if Roger understood correctly, was much larger than it first appeared. The corridor forked immediately. Down the left branch, Roger spotted the aforementioned bunks, small, coffin-sized cubicles 3 tiers high, each with only a tatty old curtain for privacy. There were lockers opposite for stowing luggage or hanging up one's coat, presuming you didn't sleep in it. They weren't actually that uncomfortable, and Roger would have survived using one for just the single night, but he was grateful the company had splashed out for a proper room all the same. Fishing his datapad from one of the pockets of his coat as he followed the corridor straight ahead, Roger scrolled through his communications until he reached his booking confirmation. He found the room allocated for him, typed the code into the keypad installed beside the door, and let out a deflating sigh of relief as it unlocked. Something told him the girl at reception wouldn't have been much help if it hadn't. The ceiling light flickered on as he entered. The room was smaller than the reception, which hardly surprised him. A bed, smaller than a double but not quite a single either, lined the full length of the rear wall and was neatly made with a thick duvet and an additional blanket folded at its foot. The room was slightly warmer than the rest of the station, but not by much. The walls themselves were plastic panelled and white, though the floor and ceiling remained grey concrete. There was no wardrobe, but a chrome rail jutted out from one of the panels. A shower cubicle occupied the corner near the door. When Roger pushed the gently flashing button on its curved front, its rubbery casing rolled aside to reveal the toilet and sink too. Roger pushed his suitcase under the rail and sat down hard on the bunk. Sure, this was a far cry from the comforts he enjoyed at home, but the bed was clean, the shower was private, and the door would be locked while he slept. That was good enough for him. He still had his datapad clutched in one hand, and now he brought up Erin's comm details. He'd promised to video call her once he arrived, let her know he got there safely. The circle on the screen cycled twice, but the call wouldn't connect. Damn outposts never had decent comm infrastructure. He settled for a quick text message instead. With any luck, it could scrape together enough signal to send before he arrived at the Desmodontae. His stomach rolled again. Roger checked his watch. He still had a good few hours before he needed to hit the hay. But it wasn't food Roger had in mind. "They've got beer, they've got wine, they've got everything that's fine," he mumbled to himself. Looks like he was headed to Maisie's.